The air in the grand hall was thick with a kind of silent reverence. It was the kind of quiet that only settles in a place where history has been made, where the wooden floors have felt the weight of legends. Today, the legend was sitting, not at the grand piano on stage, but in a simple velvet chair in the center of the room. He was a man whose name was spoken in hushed tones in the most prestigious concert halls across the world. A pianist. A genius. At 40, he had achieved everything a musician could dream of, but as he sat there, his expensive suit feeling a little too tight, a wave of profound boredom washed over him. He had seen it all, heard it all, and it had all become a predictable, dull routine. He was here to give a master class, a privilege for which the students had paid fortunes and the conservatory had spent months arranging. Around him sat the young, the hopeful, the terrified. They clutched their sheet music like shields, their fingers nervously tracing the notes they would soon be judged on. The pianist's gaze swept over them, a cool, analytical look that seemed to see right through their ambitions and into their very fears. He was known for his sharp tongue, for his ability to dismantle a performance with a single cutting remark. He didn't believe in coddling talent. He believed in breaking it down to see if anything of real substance was left. The first student, a young man with trembling hands, was summoned to the piano. He played a piece by Bach, a complex fugue that required incredible technical skill. His fingers flew across the keys, hitting every note with machine-like precision. It was flawless, perfect. When he finished, a small, proud smile touched his lips. The room waited for the maestro's verdict. The famous pianist let the silence hang in the air for a long moment, tapping a single finger on his chin. Finally he spoke, his voice flat and devoid of emotion. Technically, he began, and the young man's posture straightened. It was perfect. You didn't miss a single note, but it was also dead. It had the life of a calculator. You played the notes, but you didn't play the music. Bach was a man of faith, of passion. Your playing was an exercise in typing. Next. The young man's face fell, the pride draining away, replaced by a hot blush of humiliation. He gathered his music and scurried back to his seat. The next victim was a young woman who chose a passionate, dramatic piece by Rachmaninoff. She threw her whole body into it, her face a mask of emotion, her swaying in time with the thundering chords. She was trying to impress him with her soul. But her technique was sloppy. Notes were blurred, rhythms were rushed in her excitement. When she finished, breathing heavily, the pianist didn't even let the final echo die. Passion without discipline is just noise, he stated, his voice dripping with condescension. You felt it, I'm sure? But we, the audience, only felt your struggle. You were fighting the piano, not dancing with it. Learn the rules before you try to break them. Next. Another dream, publicly shattered. He continued this way, a predator moving through a herd. He was a master of his craft, but he had forgotten the joy of it. Music, for him now, was no longer an art form but a problem to be solved, a code to be cracked. And these students, with their earnest efforts, were just amateur programmers. He was growing restless, his mind already drifting to the dinner he was scheduled to attend later. Another evening of fake smiles and empty compliments. His eyes scanned the room one last time, looking for a final subject to dismiss before he could make his escape, and then he saw her. She was in the back row, a little removed from the others. She wasn't clutching any sheet music. Her hands were resting calmly in her lap, unlike the others who were all staring at him. At the piano, at the floor, anywhere to avoid his gaze. Her face was turned forward, her head slightly cocked, as if she were listening to something no one else could hear. Her eyes, a pale, milky blue, were unfocused. It was then that he realized she was blind. A slow, cruel smile touched his lips. This was interesting. This was a break from the monotony. Here was someone who couldn't even see the notes, who couldn't witness the grand drama of his own performances. What could she possibly understand about the world he inhabited? The other students began to notice the shift in his attention. They followed his gaze to the young woman in the back. A murmur of curiosity rippled through the room. What was he going to do? He had already established his impossible standards. To call upon her now seemed less like a teaching moment and more like a public spectacle. He leaned back in his chair, steepling his fingers under his chin. The boredom was gone, replaced by a sharp, predatory interest. He had found his final act for the day. He was going to make an example of her, not to teach a lesson about music, but to amuse himself, to reassert his absolute dominance in this room. He raised a hand, gesturing lazily in her direction, his voice cutting through the tense silence like a knife. "You there?" he called out, his tone laced with a challenge that made everyone in the room hold their breath. "Come up here." The words hung in the air, sharp and heavy. "You there? Come up here." A collective, almost silent gasp rippled through the room. Every head turned, not towards the famous pianist, but towards the back row, towards the young woman he had singled out. The other students exchanged nervous glances. This was beyond a critique. It was turning into something else, something uncomfortable and public. They felt a strange mix of pity for her and a guilty relief, that it wasn't them in the spotlight, but the girl didn't seem to feel pity or fear. She simply tilted her head in the direction of the voice, her expression unreadable. After a moment of stillness, she reached down beside her chair and picked up a long white cane. With a smooth, practiced motion, she unfolded it. The soft click of the lock was the only sound in the hall. Then she stood up. She didn't hurry. She moved with a quiet, unhurried grace that was somehow more commanding than the nervous energy of the other students. Her journey to the stage was a performance in itself. The cane began its rhythmic dance, a gentle tap-tap-tap on the polished wooden floor. It was not the sound of someone lost or uncertain. It was the sound of someone mapping her world with precision and confidence. She didn't shuffle. Her steps were sure and measured. As she walked, her face remained forward, her milky eyes fixed on a point only she could perceive. She seemed to be feeling the room with more than just her cane. She was feeling the space, the weight of the stairs, the way the sound of her own footsteps echoed back at her from the high ceilings. The other students watched her, their own anxieties momentarily forgotten. They were seeing a different kind of navigation, a different kind of sight. The pianist watched her too, a cruel amusement playing on his lips. He leaned back in his chair, making a show of his patience. He was enjoying this. He was enjoying the power he held, the ability to disrupt the entire room with a few words. He saw her not as a person, but as an interesting prop in the boring play of his day. A blind girl at a piano masterclass. The irony was delicious to him. When she reached the steps leading up to the stage, she didn't hesitate. She tapped the edge of the first step, then the second, counting them silently in her head. She ascended with the same steady rhythm and walked across the vast, empty stage until she stood beside the grand piano. It was a monster of an instrument, black and gleaming, a symbol of the very visual, technical world he ruled. She stood next to it, a small figure in its shadow, and waited. The silence in the room was now a physical thing, thick and suffocating. The pianist finally broke it. He rose from his chair and walked slowly towards her, his polished shoes making soft sounds on the stage floor. He circled her on the piano like a shark. "So," he began, his voice loud and casual, meant for the entire audience to hear. "You seem to be the only one in this room who isn't scribbling notes in terror. You've just been listening. Tell me, what is your perspective on music? You can't see the keys, the complex patterns on the page, the conductor's dramatic gestures. For you, is it just vibrations? A series of bumps in the road?" A few of the students let out a nervous, half-stifled titter. It was an ugly sound, but the tension in the room was so high that they couldn't help it. The pianist's question was designed to be demeaning, to reduce her entire experience of music to a primitive, physical sensation. He was stripping the art away, leaving only what he assumed was her limited perception. The girl didn't flinch. She didn't lower her head. She simply stood there, her posture straight, her hands resting calmly at her sides. When she finally spoke, her voice was clear and steady, and it carried a surprising strength that cut through his condescension. "For me, sir," she said, her face still turned in his general direction, "it is color and shape. It is the only world I can see." The answer was so unexpected, so poetic and firm, that it caught him off guard. He blinked, his smirk faltering for just a second. He had expected her to be intimidated, to mumble something apologetic. He had not expected this quiet declaration of a rich inner world. His annoyance flared. He was the one who defined the world of music here, not her. He let out a short, sharp laugh. "A poetic answer," he said, his voice now dripping with sarcasm. "Very nice. But poetry doesn't win international competitions. It doesn't fill concert halls. Let's test your little theory. Let's see these colors and shapes of yours." He gestured dismissively towards the piano bench. "Sit, play something for us. Anything you like?" The challenge was thrown. It was a public gauntlet designed to humiliate. He was expecting a simple, fumbling tuna child's melody at best. He was setting her up for a fall, a spectacle for the others to witness and learn from. This was his final, cruel lesson. That talent without the full use of one's senses was a joke. The girl didn't argue. She didn't protest. She simply gave a slight, almost imperceptible nod. She moved towards the bench, her hand reaching out to find its smooth, wooden surface. She ran her fingers along the edge before sitting down, her posture poised and balanced. She didn't immediately place her hands on the keys. Instead, she sat there for a long moment, her hands resting in her lap. She seemed to be listening to the silence, to the energy of the room. The pianist stood beside the piano, his arms crossed tightly over his chest, his expression a mask of smug anticipation. The audience leaned forward, a sea of anxious faces. The girl took a slow, deep breath. Then she lifted her hands and brought them over the keys, her fingers hovering just above the ivory, feeling the heat radiating from them, sensing the immense potential coiled within the instrument, waiting to be released. For a moment, her hands just rested there, her fingers light as feathers on the cool ivory. The famous pianist stood beside her, his arms still crossed, his expression a fortress of smug certainty. He was already composing the cutting remark he would use when she finished. He imagined her playing a simple, clumsy tune, something a child might learn in their first month of lessons. He would pat her on the head, say something about her spirit, and dismiss her. The thought brought a flicker of a smile back to his lips. The room was so quiet you could hear the soft hum of the lights overhead, then her fingers moved, they didn't press down. They seemed to sink into the keys as if becoming one with them. The first notes that filled the hall were not simple. They were not clumsy. They were the opening of a piece he knew better than his own name. It was one of his signature pieces, a fiendishly difficult etude by Chopin that he had performed in countless sold-out concerts around the world. A wave of surprise, followed by a surge of annoyance, washed over him. She was either incredibly brave or incredibly foolish to attempt this. He leaned in, ready to pick apart her inevitable technical failures, but the failures didn't come. Her fingers, which he had expected to falter, danced across the keys with a strength and a grace that was breathtaking. She wasn't just hitting the right notes. She was shaping them. Each note was a perfect, polished gem, but it was the way they connected that was truly magical. Where his own performance of the piece was a marvel of speed and precision, a dazzling display of technical prowess, hers was something else entirely. It was a conversation. The music began to tell a story. It started with a quiet, questioning phrase, full of a gentle sadness. It was like the sound of rain on a window pane, each drop a separate, perfect thought. The students in the audience, who had been holding their breath in a mix of pity and dread, found themselves leaning forward. Their bodies relaxed. Their nervousness was replaced by a deep, sudden focus. They weren't just listening to a piano being played. They were being drawn into a world. The pianist's smirk had completely vanished. His arms had uncrossed and fallen to his sides. He was no longer a judge. He was a member of the audience, just like everyone else. He watched her hands, which moved with a certainty that seemed impossible. They flew through the most rapid, complex passages without a hint of hesitation. But it wasn't the speed that captivated him. It was the emotion. She was playing the same notes he had played 1,000 times, but she was finding sounds in them he had never heard. As the music swelled, it became a torrent of passion. It was no longer gentle rain. It was a thunderstorm full of anger and longing and a desperate, aching beauty. The melody wept and raged, sometimes in the same breath. A young woman in the third row discreetly wiped a tear from her cheek. The man next to her stared, his mouth slightly open, completely lost in the sound. The entire hall was under a spell. The only movement was the subtle swaying of the girl's body, which rocked with the piano as if she and the instrument were a single entity. Breathing together, the pianist felt a strange, unfamiliar tightening in his chest. He remembered learning this piece as a young man. He remembered the countless hours of practice, the obsessive focus on getting every finger position perfect, every pedal change exact. He had mastered it. He had conquered it. But listening to her, he realized he had never truly understood it. He had treated the music like a mathematical equation to be solved, and he had found the correct answer. She was treating it like a living, breathing thing, and she was letting it speak. She had said music was color and shape. As he listened, he began to see what she meant. A fast, cascading run of notes wasn't just a scale. It was a shimmering silver waterfall. A deep, resonant chord wasn't just harmony. It was a vast, dark blue space you could fall into. Her blindness was not a handicap. It was a gift. It had stripped away all the distractions. She didn't see the gleam of the piano, the reflection of the lights, the score on the page, the faces in the crowd. She only heard. And because she only heard, she heard everything. Every nuance, every shade of feeling, every secret hidden deep within the notes. The music reached its climax, a storm of such power and intensity that it felt like the hall itself might shake apart. Her fingers were a blur, a whirlwind of motion that should have been impossible to control. Yet every note was clear, every emotion sharp and defined. And then, as suddenly as it had begun, the storm passed. The music softened, returning to the quiet, questioning sadness of the beginning. It was a sigh of resignation, a final, peaceful acceptance. She played the last chord. Her fingers lifted from the keys, and the sound hung in the air, shimmering and fragile, before slowly, gently fading into nothing. And then there was silence. It was a profound, deafening silence. No one moved. No one breathed. It was as if the music had been so powerful that it had erased the world, and they were all floating in the empty space it left behind. No one clapped. It felt wrong to break the spell with something as crude as applause. The students just sat there, their faces reflecting a mixture of awe and wonder. Some were crying openly now, not from sadness, but from the sheer, overwhelming beauty of what they had just experienced. The famous pianist stood frozen, his face a mask of utter disbelief. The man who lived for applause, for the sound of his own name being cheered, was grateful for the silence. He needed it. He needed the quiet to process what had just happened. His entire career, his entire identity as an artist, had been built on a foundation of technical perfection. He had believed that was the pinnacle of music. In the span of 5 minutes, this blind girl had not just challenged that belief. She had completely shattered it. She had shown him a world of music he never knew existed, a world he had been too blind to see. He looked at her, sitting so still at the piano, her head bowed, and he felt smaller than he had ever felt in his life. He was no longer the master. He was the student. The silence that followed was not empty. It was full. It was a heavy, sacred space that had been carved out by the music, and no one dared to fill it. In the grand hall, 100 people seemed to have stopped breathing. The air, which had been so thick with tension and anxiety just moments before, was now charged with a different kind of energy. It was awe. It was wonder. It was the feeling you have when you witness something so pure, so beautiful, that words feel like a clumsy, useless tool. Not a single person thought of clapping. To do so would have been like shouting in a cathedral. It would have shattered the moment, and no one wanted that. They wanted to live inside the echo of what they had just heard for as long as they possibly could. The famous pianist stood as if frozen in time. His face, which had been a mask of smug certainty, was now a canvas of pure, unadulterated shock. His mind, usually a sharp, analytical instrument capable of deconstructing any piece of music in seconds, was a blank wall. The sounds he had just heard were still reverberating inside him, not just in his ears, but in his bones, in his soul. He tried to process it, to compare it to his own understanding of the piece, but there was no comparison. His own performance was a perfectly built machine, all gleaming chrome and flawless engineering. Hers was a living, breathing creature. It had a heartbeat. It had a soul. He had played the notes. She had told the truth. Slowly the shock began to recede, and in its place, a feeling rose up that he had not experienced in a very long time. Shame. A hot, creeping wave of it washed over him as he replayed the events of the last hour in his mind. He saw himself mocking the young man who played Bach with technical perfection. He heard his own cruel voice dismissing the young woman's passionate attempt at Rachmaninoff. And then, worst of all, he remembered the way he had spoken to the blind girl. His condescending tone, his sarcastic questions about vibrations and bumps in the road. Each word came back to him now, not as a clever, witty remark, but as the petty, cruel jab of a small, insecure man. He had used his fame and his talent as a weapon, and he had tried to humiliate a young woman who possessed a depth of artistry he could only dream of. The weight of his own arrogance settled on him, crushing and suffocating, and through it all the girl just sat there. She hadn't moved from the piano bench. Her hands were resting in her lap, her head bowed slightly. She wasn't preening or looking for praise. She seemed to be in a state of quiet communion with the instrument, as if she were gently saying goodbye to a dear friend. Her stillness was a stark contrast to the storm of emotions raging inside the pianist and the silent turmoil in the hearts of the students. She was the calm center of the hurricane she had just created. Her quiet dignity was more powerful than any applause, any standing ovation. It was a statement in itself. Finally, the pianist moved. It was a slow, deliberate motion, as if his joints had rusted solid. He took a step away from the piano, then another. The sound of his expensive leather shoes on the stage floor was different now. It wasn't the confident, sharp tap of a master surveying his domain. It was a heavy, uncertain shuffle. He walked around the side of the grand piano, his eyes never leaving the girl. The students watched him, their bodies tense, wondering what he would do. Would he try to regain control of the room with another cutting remark? Would he simply dismiss her and end the class? He did neither. He stopped in front of her, not standing over her in a position of power, but a few feet away, giving her space. He looked down, not at her unseeing eyes, but at her hands, the hands that had just dismantled his entire worldview. He took a deep, shaky breath, the kind of breath a man takes when he is about to dive into deep water. When he finally spoke, his voice was a ghost of its former self. It was quiet, stripped of all its arrogance and sharp edges. It trembled slightly, not with weakness, but with the sheer force of the emotion he was trying to contain. "I was wrong," he said. The words were simple, but they landed in the silent hall with the weight of a confession. He paused, swallowing hard before continuing. "I have spent my life, my entire life, seeing the music. I see the notes on the page, the patterns on the keys, the faces in the crowd. I have spent decades perfecting the sight of it all." He looked up, his gaze sweeping over the stunned students before returning to the girl at the piano. "And today," he said, his voice cracking slightly, "you taught me how to listen." A soft, collective sigh seemed to pass through the room. It was the sound of 100 people releasing a breath they didn't know they were holding. The pianist's apology was not just for the girl. It was for everyone. It was for the music itself. He was admitting in front of everyone that his foundation was flawed, that this young woman who he had tried to mock was his superior in the one thing that mattered most. The students looked at their teacher, and for the first time that day they didn't see a tyrant. They saw a man who had just been humbled, and in his humility he had become more real, more human, than he had been in the entire master class. The girl didn't say anything. She didn't need to. She simply turned her head slightly in the direction of his voice, a small, almost imperceptible nod acknowledging his words. Her grace in that moment was devastating. There was no triumph in her posture, no "I told you so" in her expression. There was only a quiet acceptance. She had not played to win an argument or to prove a point. She had played because the music was inside her and it needed to come out. His apology was his own journey, his own lesson to learn. The pianist felt a strange sense of relief, as if a great weight he had been carrying for years had suddenly been lifted. The weight of his own fame, the pressure to always be the best, the sharpest, the most brilliant, it all seemed to melt away in the face of her simple, profound artistry. He looked at the other students, not with the critical eye of a judge, but with the newfound curiosity of a fellow student. He wondered what music was hiding inside each of them, what colors and shapes they might be able to show him if he could just learn to listen. The master class was over, but for the famous pianist, the lesson had just begun. The silence in the hall was a living thing. It stretched on, not awkwardly, but comfortably, like a warm blanket. The students remained in their seats, glued to them, as if moving might break the fragile magic that still hung in the air. The famous pianist's apology had been the final, breathtaking note of a performance they would never forget. They looked at their teacher, and for the first time they saw not a celebrity or a tyrant, but a man. A flawed, human man who had just been brave enough to admit his flaws in front of everyone. In that moment of vulnerability, he had earned more respect than all his technical mastery and sharp critiques ever had. The girl at the piano remained still for a long moment after his words faded. Then she gave a small, slow nod. It wasn't a gesture of victory, but of acceptance. She understood. With a quiet grace, she slid her hands along the smooth wood of the piano bench and pushed herself back. She stood, found her cane with an easy motion, and folded it. The pianist watched her, his expression soft, his eyes filled with a wonder that was new to him. He turned to the room, his voice quiet but clear. "The master class is over," he said. "You may all go." The students hesitated for a second, then began to gather their things, moving slowly, quietly, as if leaving a sacred space. As they filed out of the hall, their whispers were not of gossip or fear, but of awe. "Did you hear that? I've never felt anything like it. Did you see his face?" The story had already begun to grow into a legend. When the last student had gone and the great doors swung shut, the pianist and the girl were alone in the vast, echoing hall. He walked back to the stage, his steps no longer heavy with arrogance, but purposeful. He stopped a few feet from her. "Please," he said, his voice gentle. "Stay, just for a moment." She turned her head towards his voice, waiting. He struggled for the right words. The man who always had a cutting remark ready now found himself speechless. "How?" he finally asked, the word full of genuine, childlike curiosity. "How do you do it? You said it was color and shape? I need to understand." A small, faint smile touched her lips. "It's hard to explain," she said softly. "When I hear a C minor chord, I don't just hear a sound. I feel a deep, dark blue. It's heavy, like a thick velvet curtain. A major chord is bright yellow, like sunlight on a wall. A fast run of notes isn't just fast. It's like 1,000 tiny silver bells all ringing at once, or like a waterfall of light." He listened, captivated, his mind trying to build a new world from her descriptions. "And when I play," she continued, "I'm not thinking about my fingers or the keys. I'm just trying to paint a picture with those colors. I'm trying to tell a story with those shapes. The music is already there, inside me. I just have to let it out." In that quiet conversation, the pianist felt something inside him shift permanently. The wall he had built around his heart, the wall of fame and perfection, crumbled into dust. He saw his own career in a new light. He had been a technician, a master craftsman. She was an artist. "You have a gift," he said, and it wasn't a compliment. It was a statement of fact, spoken with reverence. And the world needs to hear it. Not just in a master class, on the world's stages. He made a promise to her then and there, a promise not out of guilt, but out of a deep, newfound respect. He would use his name, his influence, his money, not to build his own legacy higher, but to open the doors for her. He would become her advocate, her champion, her student, The story of that day at the conservatory spread through the music world like wildfire. It was told in practice rooms and concert halls, a modern parable about a master humbled by a student who couldn't even see him. And the pianist was true to his word. He underwent a transformation that was visible to everyone. His own playing changed. It became less about flawless technique and more about raw, honest emotion. He smiled more. He listened more. He found a joy in music that he hadn't felt since he was a child, discovering the piano for the first time. He became a different kind of teacher, one who encouraged, who looked for the soul behind the notes. He found the best teachers for the girl, composers and musicians who could help her refine her incredible natural talent. He paid for her education, her travel, everything she needed. He never sought credit for it. In fact, when reporters asked about his sudden change in demeanor, he would just smile and say, "I was lucky enough to meet a real teacher." He and the girl developed a unique and profound friendship. He would sit for hours in her small apartment, just listening to her play, not as a critic, but as a fan. She, in turn, taught him to listen not just with his ears, but with his heart, to find the colors and shapes in the silence between the notes. Years later, the night of her debut at one of the most famous concert halls in the world arrived. The hall was sold out. The air buzzed with the energy of 1,000 people who had come to witness the legend in person. In the front row sat the pianist. He was no longer the center of attention, and he had never been happier. He was just another member of the audience, his heart pounding with a nervous pride that was more intense than anything he had ever felt on his own opening nights. She walked onto the stage, her white cane tapping its familiar rhythm, and the crowd fell silent. She sat at the grand piano, and for a moment she just sat there, her hands hovering over the keys. Then she began to play. The music that filled the hall was the same music from that day in the master class, but it was even more powerful now, honed by years of practice and guided by a wisdom that was far beyond her years. It was a story of darkness and light, of sorrow and joy. A story painted in colors that everyone in the audience, for the first time, could almost see when she finished. The silence was followed by an explosion of sound. The entire hall was on its feet, roaring their approval. The applause was deafening, a tidal wave of love and admiration washing over the stage. She stood and took her bow, her face serene. As she stood there, bathed in the warm light of the stage, she turned her head slightly, just a fraction, towards the front row, towards the man who had once mocked her, but who had become her greatest champion. It was a silent acknowledgement, a shared moment in a story that had changed them both. The famous pianist had once ruled the world of music, but on this night he was just a grateful witness, finally understanding that the most beautiful music isn't the one you see, but the one you feel.